For Parshas Tazria, we're going to discuss as we go along many different dimensions of the Tumah, the laws of Tumah of Tzaras, and their meaning. Try to find some metaphors in the various manifestations of the Tumah of Tzaras. But first, we open up with the case of Yoledis. The Parsha describes a situation in which a woman gives birth. She goes through a certain period of tumah, and she has to separate herself from her husband following the birth. She's also required to bring karbonos for a karpara, and the Torah also injects into this parsha the mitzvah of milah on the 8th day. Let me say a few words about the mitzvah of milah. From one perspective, the mitzvah of milah, like any other mitzvah in the Torah, like taking a lulav, has what we call a ma'aseh mitzvah, an external act, and one is got to perform the mechanical act, and that is the ma'aseh milah. But in the case of milah, as opposed to almost any other mitzvah in the Torah, there's another dimension entirely, which is the result of the action of the mitzvah, and that is the change in the personality, in the status of the person, in this case, the child. A ben bris has a new status, and I'll prove it to you. The law is that an Arel who is uncircumcised is not allowed to enter into the Beis HaMikdash, nor is he allowed to participate in Kodshim. He cannot eat from Basar Kodesh. With the Milah, the individual now becomes elevated into a new status. He enters into a new dimension in which he can enter into the Mikdash, he can eat Kodshim. He's a ben bris. And that makes milah very different than any other mitzvah, because above and beyond the ma'aseh mitzvah, which applies to any mitzvah, I eat matzah, I shake a lulav, I sit in the sukkah, it's a ma'aseh mitzvah. And I have a ma'aseh mitzvah of milah as well. But there's another dimension, as we said, and that's the impact of the milah and the change of status. These two dimensions of milah reflect themselves in two brachos. We recite two brachos on milah. Whereas every other mitzvah gets one bracha, we're very stingy. We don't give out more than one bracha, one tiki per person. But in the case of milah, we have two brachos. The first bracha, lachniso, is on the ma'aseh milah. Excuse me, let me start again. The first bracha, asher kishonu tzosem tzivonu al mitzvahs milah, is on the ma'aseh milah. But then there's a second bracha, lachniso bebriso shel Avram Avinu. And that bracha is on the change of status. Now, in a different context, we discussed, you may recall, why Avram Avinu was so challenged by the mitzvah of milah. His patrons, his friends told him that it would separate him from the nations of the world. And Hashem had to calm him down and console him by telling him, I will be your friend. God says you have one trusty, loyal friend, and that's bris milah. But we discussed that in a different occasion. It's not for now. What I do want to mention, though, in the context of these two dimensions and these two brachas on the mitzvah of milah, is a parallel with regard to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah, like any other mitzvah, has its own identified, well-defined mitzvah act. And that is the intellectual involvement, endeavor of studying the Torah. But in addition, Talmud Torah has an impact on the person. It changes the status of he who knows Torah, and I'll prove it to you. The halacha is that after a person studies Torah and he acquires Torah knowledge, he's called muchtar b'keser Torah. He is wearing a crown of Torah. We find a crown with regard to kahuna and with regard to malchus. No doubt a kohen is what we call in brisket terminology, a chal Hashem in gavra, a change in the status of the person. No doubt that melech is a chal Hashem in gavra. But no other mitzvah that we know of changes the status of a person and generates a change in the chal Hashem in gavra, except for these two mitzvahs. The mitzvah of milah, when the child becomes a ben bris, and that changes status with many repercussions, and Talmud Torah, where as a result of Torah study, the Torah student is muchtar b'keser Torah, as the Rambam describes it in the 3rd chapter of Hilchos Talmud Torah. He becomes crowned. He becomes, in a sense, changed. The transformation in his very personality. In a halachic sense, we have to stand up for him. He has certain rights as a Talmud Chacham. He is the teacher. And we're going to discuss this later on, how much of a leadership role he will play. And this is all a result of Torah study. So Torah study, unlike other mitzvahs, has an impact on the person, upgrades his status. It is a chal Hashem in Gav. Now, let's talk about a very, very famous Medrash Tanchuma here in Parshas Tazria. The Medrash records a conversation, a dialogue, if you will, between that terrible Roman governor who was evil of all evils, Turnus Rufus, and his encounter with Rabbi Akiva. And he said to Rabbi Akiva, in your religion, God hates the uncircumcised, the Arelin, they are excluded. So why did God create man uncircumcised? Wouldn't it make sense that if God despises Arelus, that he would create man already circumcised? And to that, Rabbi Akiva responded, wouldn't it have been great if God had created loaves of bread? And all we would need is to take a loaf of bread, cut it up and eat it. No, God wants us to work. God wants us to improve. We are called upon to make an impact on the world in which we live. We are not passively enjoying the benefit of the land. We're not given a fully baked loaf of bread ready to eat. We have to plant and we have to harvest and we have to bake the dough. It's a long, long process called Sidura de Pas. And this is really indicative of all of halakha. Halakha is predicated on the concept of man being makadesh. Man has to sanctify something. For example, in terms of a yontif, man is called upon to sanctify the day and make it endowed with the kedusha of yontif. Other examples, bikurim, kodshim. A man wants to bring an animal as a sacrifice on the mizbeach. He has to be makadesh. Man is called upon to actively generate kedusha and change the status of the object, uplifting it as it will, and endowing it with the status of being sacramonial. And therefore, in the case of Mila, Rabbi Akiva points out, man was not created mohul. He has to do that action to sanctify himself, to generate that kedusha through the Maisa Mila. And it's so fascinating that the role of man is to endow objects with holiness. There are very few exceptions. Maybe Shabbos, but even Shabbos, probably man through Kiddush does add another dimension of sanctity. But take, for example, Sefer Torah. Did you know that a Torah scroll could be the most beautiful scroll written on the most finest cloth with the greatest ink, and yet it does not have Kedusha Sefer Torah? The Sofer has to have in mind when he creates that Sefer Torah, the Shem Kedusha Sefer Torah. And certainly when he writes the Shemos of Hashem, the holy names of God, he has to have that intention. Once again, another example of the halacha that recognizes man's active involvement in generating sanctity and changing the nature of reality, creating sanctified objects out of otherwise profane and mundane objects. And this is the message, I believe, of Rabbi Akiva about Judaism. Judaism is all about man taking the active role in changing the environment, changing the world in which he lives. In Hasidic thought, we find that the Torah that one studies here could have an impact as his speech flies all the way to the other side of the world. Man is called upon to make that endowment, to generate Kedusha, to change the world that he lives in from a spiritual perspective. And that is represented here at the beginning of Parshas Tazria with the mitzvah of Mila, as the Medrash records Rabbi Akiva in his discussion with that Roman governor. The Torah then goes on to say, in Pasuk Zion, here at the beginning of Parshas Tazria, so we're in the 12th parak of Vayikra, and we're looking at Pasuk Zion, and the Torah mandates the Kohanim to bring the korban of Yoledes, of a woman who gave birth, and v'chiper oleha, to give her an atonement. And all the Mefarshim are baffled. What crime did she commit? On the contrary, she did the greatest of all mitzvahs. She brought human life into this world. And yet, paradoxically, the Torah requires that she undergo a process of sacrifice, of karbanos, of kapara, to achieve atonement for what sin? The Ramban, based on Chazal, elaborates about the fact that a woman in labor, excruciating pain, takes upon herself a vow that she will never resume intimate relationships with her husband. And that vow is against the Torah, because a man and a woman in marriage are obligated in that framework to continue an intimate relationship and to bring children into this world. And her vow, therefore, is a false vow. She needs a kapara for taking that vow. However, other Mefarshim, and this we find in the Kli Yakar, we find it in Hasidic works, connect the kapara of Yoledes with the sin of Chava, of the Eitz Hadas. And at the face of it, it seems like an irrational analogy. What logic is there to connect the fact that Chava ate from the Eitz Hadas to the Yoledes who gives birth, and now needs kapara for the sin of Chava? Perhaps we could say the following. The Medrash tells us at the beginning of the Chumash that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had full intention of permitting the fruits of the Eitz Hadas to man. The test, according to Chazal, of the very first and only single tzivui that Adam and Chava received was the test of patience. They had a desire to eat from the tree, but it was illegal. It was against the will of God. It was one of the most severe violations, because that's the only mandate they got from God, and yet, like Avodah Zarah, they violated that very single command they had. They were without any patience. Had they only waited till Shabbos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have said, you can eat from the Eitz Hadas. But they didn't have that patience. Man, represented by the sin of Adam and Chava, is impatient. They don't want to work. They don't want to wait. The Rambam, and before him Rashi, seem to indicate that to achieve Torah knowledge, we need Yigiyah. We need to work and toil. There are no simple, easy ways of skipping steps. No one is born with Torah in his mind once the Malach made us forget it. And therefore, man has to take upon himself to patiently and painstakingly, step by step, build, learn, study more and more and more in order to achieve Torah knowledge. And this is true for every aspect and every dimension of human behavior. Yadus as a religion puts tremendous emphasis on patience. There's no skipping steps. Those who think that you can make someone into a Baal Tshuva, it's bang, as they say, overnight, it's not. It's got to be built step by step. It's a process, and it requires a great deal of patience and a great deal of labor. It should be a labor of love. And therefore, perhaps we could say that in the case of childbirth, there's a certain, if I could call it, resentment on the part of a Yoledes, a woman in childbirth, to the fact that she is undergoing such suffering and so much pain. But what's the goal? It's to bring human life into this world. And the curse that was metaphysically imposed upon Chava of suffering through childbirth, the etzem toldi banos, is meant to indicate that life, yes, is full of suffering. We do have to work hard. We do have to take pains. Things don't just happen. There's no silver spoon. We have work to do, and it requires a great deal of effort. When a man comes home after a great and very hard day of labor and he eats his meal, he wants to rest. He wants to take his shoes off and be comfortably resting in his couch. He doesn't want to put in the effort after a day of work and open up a Gemara, open up a Chumash, study a Daf Yomi. This requires tremendous discipline and yigia to overcome tiredness and push and push. Every single mitzvah, and especially the study of Torah, requires a great deal of effort. And in the case of childbirth, as a prime example, where the goal is absolutely stupendous, it's great. Chazal say the mitzvah of bringing children into the world is on the same level as Torah study, and therefore it is shakul keneged kulam, bringing Pirya V'Rivya as a mitzvah rabbah, and a woman has to realize that it is a tough climb. And in a sense, it's not just childbirth. Childbirth is easy compared to raising a child. How much suffering, how much sacrifice does a mother have to have in order to raise her children, mature they should be, what they should be, and to grow up as upstanding members of Klal Yisrael, to instill in the child love. Chana, for example, in her relationship with Shmuel, is a prime example of a mother who's willing to give up so much. Rachel Imenu, and we say about Rachel Imenu that only her pleas will save us from the throes of Golus and bring us back to our land. And this is the image of a Jewish mother who is willing for the goal of raising a beautiful, glorious family in Israel to sacrifice. And perhaps a woman in childbirth is going to have to learn that message of how difficult it could be to bring life into this world. But everything, any accomplishment, requires hazorim bidima, barina yiktsoru. It's bidima. When we plant something, talk about the modern state of Israel, how much blood was spilled, how much effort. What did the Jewish people have to undergo until they had a state? And this is an ongoing challenge. And this is the message of the suffering, the pain, the anguish of childbirth. The nation that emerges in Israel is like a child that is being given born, that is coming into its birth state. And there are different stages in pregnancy and childbirth. It's painful. It's a national suffering, but it's all for the greater good, to achieve that glorious goal. That's what the message is. Chava was impatient. He didn't want to wait until Shabbos. Now everything has to go easy. I don't want to overcome my temptations. Ki taiva hile naim. She sees the tree, she sees the fruit. Now I have to enjoy the benefits of it. Well, sometimes pleasure has to be postponed for a greater good. And even if it means that by postponing pleasure, you take a certain element, a module of suffering. This, I believe, is the reason why, according to many, we connect the kapara of Yoledes together with the kapara that Chava needed for her violation. There are many parts of this parsha that really require study. For example, what happens if a woman after childbirth doesn't have the funds, she's too poor to pay for these korbanos. And with great compassion, the Torah tells us that she can bring shtei torim o shnei bnei yonah, which are relatively inexpensive doves and birds, turtle birds. And yet, the Torah requires the kapara in any event, even for a poor person, but with a great deal of sensitivity and compassion for the destitute. But I'd like to now shift our discussion from tumas yoledis and the kapara that a woman needs after childbirth to the parsha of Mitzorah, which really occupies, to a large extent, the readings of both Tazria and Mitzorah. My goal here is twofold. Number one, to try to understand some of the metaphors in this parsha. And number two, to try to analyze some of the halachos of Tumas Negoim and the Tumah V'Tara aspects. I see in this parsha one great metaphor that repeats itself over and over again. Let us fast forward to Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Beis. Adam kiyeh bi'ar b'sara. The emphasis here is on the skin of the flesh. Often we can talk about manifestations of disease that enter deep into the flesh, Rahmana litzlan. But here, the Torah goes out of its way to emphasize ar b'sara. It's on the skin. In a certain sense, you could say its surface level doesn't penetrate into the basar. Now, it's very interesting that in this context, there's a certain word that is omitted. Sometimes you learn from what's written in the Torah, and other times from what's omitted from the Torah. Because if we go back to the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, there's a very important word at the beginning of this Sefer, and it appears more than once. And that is the word mikem. The pasuk says, Adam ki yakriv mikem karban lashem. Chazal derive from this pasuk that a person has to desire, he has to have a full-fledged consent and ratzon to bring a karban. It's got to come from his deeper feelings and motivations. He loves the idea of having the opportunity liskarev, to come closer to Hashem. Karban milashon liskarev. But here, in the Parsha of Mitzorah, the word mikem is omitted. And why is that so? And I believe that we can take these 2 points and weave them together as one whole. We ask the question, why is it that the Torah emphasizes ar b'sara? It's only skin deep, as we would say. And secondly, why is the word mikem omitted? Mikem means myself, my very essence. When it comes to doing mitzvos, when it comes to bringing a karban and design to come close to Hashem, it's mikem. It really manifests my very great essence of who I am and what I want to aspire to become. But in the case of a mitzorah, when the phenomenon of tzaras is a manifestation of punishment for various sins, which we'll talk about very soon, momentarily, we leave out the word mikem. The sin of man does not represent the essence of man. On the contrary, it's something skin deep. It's something external. The Rambam asks a very fundamental question in Hilchos Gerush. The Gemara tells us that if a husband refuses to divorce his wife when the halacha requires him to do so, kofen oso ad sheyoma rotzani, we can physically harass him until finally he makes the decision, my life or the get, and he makes the decision that's better for him to live even if he has to divorce his wife. And the Rambam asks the question, how can the get be valid if we coerced him to give the get? If we beat him until he's black and blue? Says the Rambam, an unbelievable chiddush of the Rambam. The Rambam says that in truth, he really, really wants to give the gift. He wants to be a good guy. He wants to fulfill the will of halacha, of God's law. But there is something on externally that prevents him. There are external barriers that inhibit him from allowing his deep will to express itself and come to the fore. And sometimes what we have to do is beat him up, in which we destroy all those externalities, those barriers, and break him down so that his true will comes to the fore. And that's another expression of this concept of ar b'saro, that in the basar, he's not a mitzorah. It's only ar b'saro. It's only skin deep. It doesn't reflect on his essence. The Jew in his essence is good and wants to do good. He identifies himself as Kihem Chayenu V'Yorchimenu, Ani Hashem. He identifies himself with God. And this is his pure, unadulterated, uncontaminated essence. The nitzots, that spark of a Jew, that sometimes, unfortunately, is quelched and is subjugated by all sorts of external pressures. But if only that inner self could come to the fore. Oh, how beautiful it is, how pure it is, how man is really good and desires to do good. And so it's very interesting. The Mefarshim in the Parsha of Achrimos of the Sorah Mishtalech on Yom Kippur, which is the pinnacle of the Kapara, when the Kohen Gadol leans his hands on top of the goat, on top of the soyer, and he recites Vidri. And he opens up with the words Kaper Na. What does Kaper mean? We speak about Kapara day in and day out. It's a word that's always on the table. Kapara, 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 Yom Kippur. But what is etymologically, what does the word mean? The Ramban points out that the word kapara is milashon linakos, to clean something. When you have a floor that needs to be cleaned, you just do a kapara on it. It's a cleansing. Cleansing means that there's no dirt that is penetrated below the surface. You just have to cleanse it and clean off the surface. Take an example of a fruit. Let's say an orange would fall into soot, and there's dirt on the outside of the orange, but that doesn't represent the inner orange. Just wash it off, clean it on the outside, and you have a beautiful orange. That's what sin is. It's only an external covering. It's dirt and it's soot. It needs kapara. Kapara means just clean it off. And once you clean off that dirt, what you have and what you've exposed is the true nature of man, the greatness and the purity of man in his very, very essence. And there's a Gemara in Nidarim that talks to us about Rabbi Yishmael, and it reflects itself also in the kinos that we recite on Tisha B'Av. The Gemara in Nidarim on Daf Samach Vav tells us about Rabbi Yishmael, that there was a man who came for Hataras Nidarim. He wanted Rabbi Yishmael to remove his vow. He had taken a vow to marry a certain woman. And at the end, he decided she's not a very beautiful, she doesn't have that appeal, and he wants to back out of his vow. And it's interesting that Rabbi Yishmael uses this occasion to create a metaphor about Knesset Yisrael. And he says, you know what? I can release you from the vow, except for one problem. This woman is a Bas Yisrael, and the daughters of Israel are beautiful. The only reason you don't see her as beautiful is because of poverty. And poverty creates a situation in which the Jewish woman, and for that matter, the Jewish man, look repulsive. But that's external. That doesn't represent Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael is beautiful. And if you took a vow to marry a beautiful Bas Yisrael, she is beautiful. And this reflects itself, as I said before, in the kinos of Tisha B'Av. The story is told in the kina about Yirmiyahu, who happens upon a poor woman, and she's totally disheveled. And he asks her, "Who are you? You look so ghastly." And she replies, "I am Knesset Yisrael," meaning I am the metaphoric representation of Knesset Yisrael. In truth, I am beautiful. B'nos Yisrael Yafosheim. And yet, poverty, and sometimes it's spiritual poverty, has done this to me. And that's why I look so repulsive. The concept of mitzora, of bi'ar bisara, is meant to convey the message that is only bi'ar bisara, but he himself, in his very self, in his very essence, in his inner soul and personality, is pure. I want to go on and talk to you a little bit about the metaphors in the halacha of mitzora. If you fast forward now to the psukim starting with Gimel and going all the way to Pasuk Hey and Vav, you'll see that there are various manifestations of tzaras that are defined by the Torah. And again, each one has to be studied in Mishnais Negoim. There are many halachas, how to identify them. But let's talk about a few of them. One of them is called sapachas. Sapachas is translated loosely into English as a scab. Again, it's very difficult to translate these words because they have such definite meaning in terms of dermatological phenomenon. And the Medrash gives us a metaphor about sapachas. And in this Medrash, Chazal analyzed the various golios, the different exiles into which the Jewish nation was taken. And each one of the different phenomenon of tzaras, as described here in Parshas Tazria, represent metaphorically a different golus, a different nation that subjugated the Jewish people. And it's fascinating that sapachas represents the golus of Madai, and the Medrash identifies this sapachas as Haman HaRosh. Haman, in the country called Madai, was raised to be wicked, and Chazal compare him to a snake. And the pasuk curses the snake, al groncha telech, that you'll walk on your belly, you'll slide, so to speak, on your belly. Haman represents that sly snake. And the truth is that Haman's behavior indicates that he thought very highly of himself. He thought that he would be the perfect candidate as the king of Madai. And when Achashverosh asks him who and how we should give honor and glory, and Haman thinks he's certainly talking about me. How did Haman achieve his goal? How did he get so high up in the court of Achashverosh? Haman understood that you need to flatter a person. He would flatter Achashverosh. Even in Esther's case, he flattered Esther HaMalka. His behavior is indicative of a haughty person who thinks so highly of himself and is very sly, figures out, like a snake, how to achieve his goal. It's so fascinating that the Hebrew word for arrogance is Gimel Aleph Hey. That word has two opposite connotations. On the one hand, it's very negative, but on the other hand, it's also positive. And I'll prove it to you. Because David HaMelech in Tehillim describes the Almighty God as Hashem Molach Geus. Geus Lavesh is the same identical word as Ge'er. And yet here it's positive. In fact, we are commanded in imitation Deo to resemble HaKadosh Baruch Hu and imitate him in Geus. So we have two types of Ge'er. We have the Ge'er of the wicked, the haughtiness of a snake of Haman, represented by this showy kind of sapachas. And on the other hand, we have self-respect, self-esteem. We have a disciplined, healthy kind of geus that is divine in nature. Mordechai represents the exact opposite of Haman. Self-esteem, yes, but no desire for glory, no haughtiness. In fact, even after he's taken around by Haman on the royal sus and so forth, immediately he goes back to Sako and he sits there as a humble person in the Chatzar Melech. Our challenge is to weave our way through these two types of geus and strive for the divine geus. The Torah tells us now, in these very same psukim, Usa'ara lo hafach lavan. The hair did not turn white. And the Gemara in Bava Metzia tells us that there was a machlokes between the Beis Din Shalmala and HaKadosh Baruch Hu about the presence of white hairs prior to Baheres. The angels up in the heavenly academy issued a ruling that this is Tameh. If there are white hairs that appear before the Baheres, that's a Simon Tumah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, no, it's a Simon Tara. Imagine a machlokes, fundamental, about the halacha Baheres, about Seir Lavan, in the Goyim, in Tzaras, goes on in the heavens. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, let's call upon one of the great scholars, Rabbi Bar Nachmani, and he will come to a final conclusion. He will be the decider, the machriya, and paskin the halacha. In fact, Rabbi Bar Nachmani paskined that it's a Simon Tara, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu blessed him. What was the nature of this machlokas about Baheres and Seir Lavan? The divine celestial beings, the Malachi Asheres, all over Chazal, are identified as Midas Hadin. They are the ones who unfortunately are Makatreg, and they come in front of the heavenly court with castigations and with accusations. They describe man as a lowly being. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a totally different approach to man, one of compassion and one of love. And thus, when there was a Simon that could be interpreted either L'tumah in the negative or L'tara in the positive, the angels, no doubt, applying their Midas Hadin, decided that this was a Simon Tumah. Man is contaminated. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on the other hand, saw the purity of man and decided that this would be a Simon Tara. And what's absolutely mind-boggling about this sugya in the Gemara Bava Metzia is that it was man who would finally make the decision. And this reflects on the famous dictum of the Kotzker Rebbe. Everybody knows this. The Kotzker Rebbe asks, why does a vest have two pockets, one on the right and one on the left? In one pocket, I put the pasuk, Vatchasreu ma'at melokim, and in the other, Anochi ofar ve'ef. Man has to realize that even Moshe Rabbeinu, as great as he was, the greatest man that ever lived, he too dies and is buried and becomes offer, may offer el offer tosh. But man is also v'tachasreu ma'at melokim. He's just a little below the divine being. He has within him such a glorious purity and a soul that is chelek eloka mimah. And so Rabba Bar Nachman is called upon to resolve, so to speak, this dispute in favor of man's purity, recognizing Vatchasreu ma'at melokim. We go on to the next siman of Tumas Tzaras, which you'll see here in Psukim Ches, Tes, and Yud, and that is Se'es. What is Se'es? Again, we're not learning the Goyim, and it requires a great deal of study. But Chazal saw Se'es as an appropriate punishment for the sin of the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah was guilty of Lashon Hara, perhaps of Motzi Shemra. He was guilty of Ayin Ra, which means envy or the unwillingness to share what he has with others. Basically, the Mitzorah is someone who suffers from arrogance, placing himself, as it were, above others, willing to castigate them, speak derogatory words about them, not willing to share with them, only experiences perhaps envy. And Se'es means some sort of a swelling of the skin. It rises above the flesh. And that concept of rising, of being gavoa, of gavus, is metaphorically symbolic of arrogance. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest enemies of the Jewish people, the king of Bavel, according to the Medrash, is compared to Se'es. And as I said before, the Medrash tries to take every one of the various manifestations of Tzaras and find a metaphor to the nations that subjugated us, and in this case, Bavel. Where do we see in Tanakh that Bavel is a personification of arrogance? I want to read to you a pasuk in Yeshaya Hanavi in Perkei Daled, in which the Navi speaks about Bavel, and he speaks about the arrogance of Bavel. The word in Tanakh, in Yeshayahu, for arrogance is midhava. And in Chazal, in the Vayikra Rabbah here in Parshas Tazria, Rabbi Abba explains midhava as referring metaphorically to the kingdom of arrogance. And that comes from the word madod. Madod means to measure. And it has to do with the gold of the royal treasury. Bavel is interested in gold, in bragging and boasting about a great accumulation in the treasuries of gold. And Yeshayahu Hanavi suggests that this is the midah of arrogance, when man measures and weighs all of his material goods to try to build up his stature and his status and show that he's greater than others. Nebuchadnezzar himself makes himself into godlike figure. He builds a monument of gold in his image and demands that all the members of his civilized world will bow down to his image. And we find in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, in Perek HaChelek, a story about Yerochavam, and he was an evil king. He originally was a great Torah scholar, one of the greatest scholars in his generation. But Yerochavam ben Nevat became a proponent of idol worship. He set up idols. The Gemara tells us in Dan and in Beisel, he prevented Jews from coming on Aliyah L'Regel. And the Gemara describes him as someone who is arrogant. He wasn't from Beis David. Halacha is that a king of Beis David does not have to stand when he enters into the Beis Hamikdash. He can remain seated. And therefore, Yerochavam was jealous of those kings that came from Beis David. And he said, why shouldn't I be given this respect? That I should be able to sit in the Beis Hamikdash, I don't have to stand. And at the end, the Gemara tells us that he issued this decree to erect golden idols in various locations in the land of Israel. And basically, we're talking about arrogance. We're talking about a person who, unfortunately, tragically, was so full of himself. At the end of this long Agadah, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Abba, who tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu grabs Yerochavam by his garment, and he says, do tshuva. And Yerochavam says, what will happen if I do tshuva? And Hashem says, I will take you, and I will take the king of Beis David, and the two of you will walk together into Gan Eden. And Yerochavam responded, who will be first? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered, it will be one of the Malchei Beis David. And Yerochavam said, if so, I'm not interested. That's the level of arrogance that ultimately leads to Avodah Zarah. We go on with another siman of Tzaras, Baheres. And this you'll see here in Perek Yud Gimel in Pasuk Chaf Hey. The Ros Kohen v'ni nepach seir lovan b'Baheres. And once again, the Medrash looks for a nation that is metaphorically represented by this tumah called Baheres, and that is Yavan. Yavan is like Baheres. Baheres is a bright spot, and it has to do with external beauty. The Greeks put all their emphasis on external beauty, and they told Klal Yisrael to inscribe a message on the horns of an ox. Kisvu lachem al keren hashor. It was apparently part of the Greek culture to write inscriptions on the karnaim of an ox. And an ox is representative of beauty, of strength. In an agricultural society, the ox plays such a strong role. All the emphasis here is on externalities. And it wasn't that the Yevanim wanted to just eradicate Judaism completely. They wanted Judaism to shift its emphasis. All of the emphasis in Yadus is on the genuine person, the inner soul, the passions of a person, his desire to fulfill the will of God. And the Greeks, on the other hand, cared much less about the emotions, about the inner, deeper feelings of a person, and the emphasis on external beauty. And that is what the Greek culture was all about. There was a tremendous clash, as you know, between the Greek philosophy and that of Yadus. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Erechim that there was a mortar and pestle that dated back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu that was used to grind the Ketores, but it had become worn out over the centuries. And Chazal sent umnim, craftsmen from Alexandria, to come from Egypt to repair these utensils. And they were able to adorn them, make them beautiful. They added a gold covering, a layering, but functionally, they were not able to get these vessels back to restore them. And Chazal say that if they can no longer be used to grind the incense and make the ketores, then remove them. They're worthless. They can look beautiful on the outside, but if on the inside they cannot function, then they are disqualified. And therefore, Yadus de-emphasizes the outside focus on beauty and instead emphasizes the essence of a person. I want to tell you something about Lita, where I was born and raised. The Lithuanian rabbis were not always great speakers. They didn't always have that dramatic, demagogic koach hadibur. My grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker, would only speak twice publicly during the entire year, on Shabbos HaGadol and Shabbos Shuvah. But yet, Reb Chaim and the city of Brisk were one and the same. His personality, his worldview, completely transformed the city of Brisk. And this was true for so many great Lithuanian rabbis. The impact that they would have on their communities in a very humble way, not with all the fanfare and the externalities of drama and oratory skills. In fact, I can tell you about Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was the final authority in Lita. He was not known as a great darshan. In fact, his community anticipated every Shabbos Shuvah exactly what he would say. Over and over again, year in and year out, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan would get up on Shabbos Shuvah and he would talk about the al-chet shechatanu lefanecha b'tipshus, the transgressions that we are foolish. And he would talk about what it means to be foolish, tipshus peh. And at some point in his drasha, as the community knew to anticipate, he would break down in tears, uncontrollably weeping publicly. And the entire community would weep with him. They were so profoundly impacted by it. Our religion puts the emphasis on deep-rooted passions and feelings. Moshe Rabbeinu was a kvad peh. He was not a great orator. He didn't have the possibility of doing so. He never really eloquently expressed his love for the Jewish people. But Chazal say that he loved the Jewish people with such a profound love. It didn't have to come out in words, in great orations and speeches. Those are external. It's the deeper emotion below the surface. When a Jew finishes his Seder, or the avodah of Yom Kippur, and he cries out, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, Often it occurs to me that when a Jew says that with such a sincere heart, that is an intense emotional internal desire for Eretz Yisrael, it means so much more than the Zionists that I hear in America that pontificate day and night about Aliyah and Eretz Yisrael, but they themselves are not prepared to uproot themselves from the United States and resettle in Eretz Yisrael. So much talk about Zionism, and yet a sincere Jew twice a year on Yom Kippur and on Leil HaSeder Leil Pesach will recite L'Shana Above Yushalom with that sense of security, of sincerity, of dedication, and of true, genuine love. What other messages can we perhaps glean from the Parsha of Tumas Mitzoras? The Torah tells us, Michutz lamachne moshava, and this you'll see in Pasuk Memvav. I would like to talk to you a little bit about this concept of the Mitzorah being sent michutz lamachne, outside the camp. Let's try to understand this parsha from a historical perspective. A person becomes inflicted with leprosy. In ancient times, the situation of the Mitzorah was absolutely desperate. There was such a phobia surrounding this disease, somewhat similar to today in contemporary life. We talk about malignancy, Rahman al-Litzah. A person takes sick, he has the symptoms of leprosy. Immediately, he loses all of his human dignity. There's no kavod habrios. He's isolated from the community. People don't want to associate with him. No one wants to greet him. Often he was killed, or at least, if he was lucky, driven out of town. And sometimes they would throw him some food, like you throw a bone to a dog. This was the lack and the loss of human dignity of the Mitzorah in ancient times. And what did the Torah say? The Torah's approach was totally different, totally focused on bringing him back into society. Who would go out and declare whether he's Tomei or not Tomei? It was the Kohen who was the leader of Israel, the Kohen who was the teacher of Torah. As the Navi says, Yishmu das v'Torah yavakesh mipiu. The Kohanim were the Leviim, and the Leviim were the leaders. The Kohanim were the judges that dedicated themselves to the study of Torah and to sitting on the highest courts in Israel and making the decisions of Israel. And it's this Kohen who's obligated to go out chutz lamachne and investigate what is the situation of this Mitzorah. And week after week after week. In fact, halacha is that the Mitzorah is allowed to call a Kohen and demand that a Kohen, even the Kohen Gadol, to go out and visit him. Imagine a Kohen who's enjoined to stay away from Tumah, and yet he's at the forefront because he represents true leadership, concern, and compassion. What is a leader in Israel? He's the Kohen in the Parsha of Mitzorah. He is the lover of Israel, the one who feels compassion for every single member of the Jewish people. He is the Moshe Rabbeinu of every generation. And the Kohen goes out to visit the Mitzorah out there, chutz lamachne, and sends him a clear-cut message. You're not alone. We are with you. We feel, we identify, we empathize. We want, more than anything, to bring you back into the fold, to be able to declare that you are tahar, you're purified. And the entire process of purification is under the the ages under the supervision of the Kohanim, the greatest leaders of the people of Israel. This is how the Torah countered and undermined that phobia in ancient worlds about leprosy, which just completely robbed the leper of his kavod ha'adam, kavod habrios. We have greats that live in our time that will be willing to visit lepers. They will be willing to lend a hand, even if it means exposing themselves to possible disease and infection, to a contagious disease. This is the concept of, as Moshe Rabbeinu expresses it, a nursing father, an omen. And this is what a leader is in Israel, a nursing father, concerned, try to heal, bring him back into society. Do everything possible that you can. This is friendship. A leader is a friend. The Torah never puts emphasis on political power and authority. All the emphasis in leadership is always the Torah teachers. These are the greats who want to share the Torah, who want to impress, uplift, and inspire the people out of a sense of love, of compassion. I am your friend. I love you. And that's what the Kohen is meant to function. V'tzivo HaKohen. The Kohen shall order. You know what the Kohen is saying? We are specialists. We're great at criticizing, at finding the chisronos. But I'm going to go out there to the mitzoras, to the mitzor, and I am going to find his positive points. I am going to purify him. He's outside the camp. Maybe he's a Jew that suffers from ignorance. He's never been touched. He's never been inspired. He's never been taught. We are here to reach out, to teach, and to uplift and inspire every single Jew. And therefore, as the Pasuk says, "Vehemet hakohen hamitayres ha'isha mitayim." Even if the Kohen himself contracts tumah in the process of coming in close contact with the Mitzorah, that's what he's willing to do. And I speak to you also about love and friendship and concern during this period of time that we're going through. I speak about the mitzvah bikur cholim during this period of time. Imagine the case of someone who's contracted a contagious disease, as unfortunately we've seen in our time. But the mitzvah still is to go visit, to express identity, identification, concern, love, and friendship. Out of that sense of compassion, we can understand and appreciate why the Kohen, when he blesses the people, he ends his bracha with the word bi'ahava. The Kohen, representing leadership, has to have love. The Shulchan Aruch Paskins, the Mishnah Berurah elaborates on it in Hilchos Nesias Kapayim, that if the Kohen harbors resentment and hatred chas v'shalom against any Jew, he is completely disqualified from Birchas Kohen, because the Kohen represents the judges of Israel, the teachers of Torah of Israel. It was the Kohanim serving on the Sanhedrin that declared Kiddush HaChodesh when the festivals would have, and he, as the leader, represents compassion and love for every single Jew. In fact, it's quite possible that the Kohen, through his acts of compassion and chesed, has a ripple effect, a spiritual impact on the entire Jewish world. Such is the power of a Moshe Rabbeinu, of a leader of Israel, to have an impact and inspiration to uplift the entire nation of Israel. He wrote something of his will, that we derive the right messages and the true moral significance of this parsha of Mitzorah. And not only in terms of the punishment that's meted out because of the arrogance of the Mitzorah, but also from the positive aspect of the mercy and the compassion. The Torah, through the Kohen, is reaching out to uplift the Mitzorah, to heal him, to soothe him, to console him, to tell him that he's not alone, and to bring him back to the fold, bring him back to society. The message to the Mitzorah is that, yes, you fell, you were guilty of some sin, but we know it's only bi'ar b'sara. It's not mikem. It's something that's external. It's the Rama min Hilchos Gerushin, that in truth, your essence is pure and good. We only have to reach out and help the people of Israel to bring them back into the fold and tell them, you are a standing member of our community. We are not rejecting you. We are not giving up on you. We know that you're going to be restored and be a major part of our community. That, my friends, is the message of Yom Kippur, the day in which the Ketores was brought by the Kohen Gadol Lifnai V'Lifnim, the only day in the year that even the Kohen Gadol was allowed to enter. Kohen Gadol himself, on the highest level of priesthood, was enjoined from entering into Kodesh Kadoshim, except on that day, to bring the Ketores and bring about the atonement, the kapara for Klal Yisrael, with the Chelbana that represents the Poche Yisrael. And if the Chelbana is not part of the Ketores is completely disqualified. And the Kohen Gadol goes in, Lifnai V'Lifnim, and on his lips, he utters the prayer, asking and begging for kapara for Klal Yisrael, out of a sense of love for the people of Israel. Kapara meaning cleaning, rinsing off that surface level of filth to expose that neshama tahorish and asata, the ratzon which bizoche, to see the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash. We could all enter in, and the Mitzorah will become Torah, and he'll enter into the Beis Hamikdash. And the entire community of Israel will be Keish Echad B'Lev Echad, feeling and sensing the compassion and love, one Jew for the other, understanding and appreciating that all we need is a kapara. We just need a cleansing, but we are more pure, tahar, in our neshama torish and asata. We should be zochet to see that speedily in our days. Kein Yiratzon. Amen. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful Shabbos. And thank you for joining me in this learning experience.
Shkoyach, Rabbi. Thank you. Shkoyach.
Thank you so much.